I'm Anthony from Haslage, and today we're going to talk about my time writing for magazines and newspapers, which lasted from 2000 to 2006. Now, of course, I did write for a number of websites as well, but that experience is a little bit different. But I also want to point out that I have a new book called The Internet Politician, which is essentially the editorial articles that I wrote for the magazines and newspapers. And it's only 99 cents, so go check it out on Amazon. The link will be included in the description. So, to explain the difference between magazines and newspapers and websites, first off, websites, they typically, at least in my case, had a weekly requirement, where magazines were, in the case of the one I was writing for, it was quarterly, although other magazines do monthly, and I'm sure there's some that do weekly. I used to have subscriptions to magazines that were weekly or monthly. Now they've gone quarterly, I guess because technology is technology. I like a nice paper magazine in my hand. Same goes for newspapers, which are dailies, typically. I actually worked for a newspaper that was bi-weekly, and that was a little different. So, essentially, how you start is typically with a planning meeting where you discuss articles and then get assignments. In all cases, usually pitch multiple ideas and you try to get them in. Now, I had, with the magazine, which is called the Mud Companion, I had the Internet Politician feature, and then I had Educating the Masses, or Mud, Multi-User Domain Dungeons. I kind of just pulled different areas that I thought would be educational to the readers, and that was typically what I did per issue. Now, for the Mud Companion, I was kind of a copy editor. I was kind of an editorial editor, and I did a lot of the promotions because for that particular magazine, and multi-user dungeons / domains are rather niche in video gaming. So it's all still text-based, on the original Dungeons and Dragons. You may remember some of the games from that are purely text-based, and you need a keyboard or something. If you know what Zork is, and then you know what I'm talking about. So we would put together a number of articles, edit them if needed. Typically they did. I don't know why, it's 2000. MS Word existed, but a lot of people just didn't seem to use it. So you go ahead and get the articles, you get the images together. Everything has to be high quality because you want to look good in print. And then you create the issue. Now, you typically have a template in which the publisher provides you, so you can make sure all your content fits. The amount of time between issues determines how frequently you get together to have that initial meeting. When I was working in newspapers, I did a lot more interviewing. So I would have a week to essentially go out, interview, come back, write the article, and then submit it. And that made things real easy. But then the magazine, I had months, and I could basically spew out multiple articles and then have them already done for pitch meetings. Newspapers wasn't so easy because also at the time, newspaper, I was in college, so I was balancing classes, working a part-time job, and doing the newspaper. Now, as far as the copy editing goes, that is essentially reading the entire magazine or newspaper before it even goes to print. That is going through everybody's articles, making sure grammar's correct, making sure headers align, etc. There is so let me real quick, because this actually got me in trouble when I first started applying for jobs. After I worked from the newspaper, when you say editor, you don't necessarily mean editor-in-chief. That's a whole different thing. A lot of people seem to think that an editor is the same as the editor-in-chief. It is not. An editor handles a department within a publication where the editor-in-chief oversees all of it. So I had in my resume for a few months before somebody actually did a reference check saying I was the editor of this newspaper. Editor-in-chief actually calls me and goes, "Hey, are you telling people you're the editor?" I was like, "Yeah, I was a copy editor. I was a news editor. I was an editor." And then okay, they're interpreting it as the EIC, and I'm like, "Well, I didn't say EIC." And I was like, "Well, here, why don't you just clarify it in your resume? Add news or copy." I'm like, "Okay, fine, whatever." I did. So I never got that complaint again. Keep that in mind. If anybody ever says they're an editor of a newspaper, they don't necessarily mean they're the editor-in-chief. once the stuff gets published, you kind of just repeat the cycle over and over again. And I did it for approximately 7 years, and then for some insane reason, I decided to do it more for websites, and I branched into previews and reviews. I actually got the first preview of Guitar Hero 3. I was invited to an event in Cleveland, and I got to play it. I think they only had like 3 or 4 songs. I think Michael Jackson, Gwen Stefani, I can't remember what else. But I spent as much time as I possibly could just playing. And I got to take pictures, and I got to talk to the people who were doing the display. Obviously, they weren't any of the developers. There was some type of event where these people were paid to take it around the country. So I had all this material, and on the plus side of publishing to websites is syndication's a lot easier. So in addition to doing like Guitar Hero, I also did a number of Funcom games. I also got a preview of Star Trek Online for Cryptic, and occasionally other studios would ask me to do things. I think I've been asked once or twice for PlayStation. I want to say Blizzard, but I don't think I actually got anything with Blizzard but an early preview. Basically, you how they do that 4-day window. You get to go in and check everything out and then write your review. I remember I had that for something. That was interesting. And then when you have the actual individual interviews of people, I did a series called 10 Questions in the late 90s through the early 2000s, where I went around to game developers. Now, at this point, I should point out that in the 90s, early 2000s, a lot of the people you see at Blizzard and Funcom, etc., are actually people who started doing multi-user dungeons or domains or MUDs, as they are called, or mushes or moos. And those people went on to those other companies, so I stayed in contact with them, and they would, of course, provide me interviews. And then I would interview other developers, and I don't think I interviewed any publishers. Well, actually, Funcom is its own publisher. So is Blizzard, as a matter of fact. Now I'm thinking, but none of the big three, like no Microsoft, no Sony, no Nintendo, but individuals from a number of gaming companies, plus a couple of individuals from service providers for those companies, because it's interesting to learn what the back end of providing a storage or streaming service for a company is. I don't remember any of it because it's almost 2 decades now, but there's a lot of good stories. And then we get to a developer, like a person who is indie, and they pretty much build the entire thing on their own in a number of cases C and C++ language, and they explain to you all the like legal ramifications, all of the issues they had, errors that were discovered that were both funny and tragic. And I worked with a number of programmers who also relayed those similar stories. And those are people things. Those are really interesting. I've actually put some of them in my book. You can actually see some of the discussion about the legalities of copying somebody's work. So those are, I found, entertaining stories. And those I would report either on a website, or if it blew up into something like that article in the Internet Politician, I would throw it into the feature. And it's a good discussion to have, because we always worry about somebody taking our work and claiming it as their own. But then other conversations happen, like the Entertainment Consumer Association was really hard on net neutrality, which no longer exists. But it essentially kept people or companies providing internet services, or ISPs, from more like tiering up the level in which they provide services. So if you were an internet user of some type, you would have to pay more because you would need more bandwidth. And internet neutrality was supposed to say, like, okay, you provide a service, you can provide it at different caps, but it can't be based on usage. So let's, for example, Spectrum, formerly Time Warner, they have a 100 megabits plan, but essentially it is a flat rate. They don't care what you do with it, but that is your cap. Your cable internet is kind of like, well, if there's too many people on it, you're going to have less bandwidth, and if it's a middle of the night, no one else is on it, you're going to get more bandwidth. But 100 is your average, right? So there was a case like saying, well, here's what we want to do. If you're a gamer, we're going to cap you at 50, megabits, and then and per second. And if you're an internet user, and then maybe we'll cap you at 10, or if you go over a certain limit during a certain amount of time, then you will be moved to the next level, which I guess makes sense in the economic sense. But then when you do that, you're basically saying to, hey, you're a gamer or you watch a lot of streaming video, we're going to penalize you, which is what a lot of people didn't like. Now, if you may remember, early in the internet, connections were limited by time and by bandwidth, which was typical for dial-up. DSL did that a little bit, but I don't think it does that now, but cable hasn't done that yet, as far as I'm aware. So that was one of the big stories I had for writing. So when you go to the websites, you can just pretty much just spit things out. It doesn't seem to have the, I want to say cojones, let's throw some Spanish in here, of something that is published in a magazine or a newspaper, which, I mean, I guess it depended on the media. Again, we're talking about the late 90s, early 2000s, where if you had 100,000 viewers, and especially because we're doing advertisements on every page of the website, number-wise, that was decent, but you really weren't getting out there very far unless you had a captive audience, kind of people who were subscribed to it. Otherwise, you're never probably going to see it. Again, the plus sides with magazines and newspapers, of course, you still got the captive audience situation, but it's more convenient, or at least it was in the late 90s, early 2000s. And now everybody has a website, and they typically paywall their content. So going along with that line of thought, it is not particularly difficult to go through the process of creating content. It is more of the, can you write well, and do you have proper grammar? Because I could spit out a 100-page something or other in about 16 hours, as long as I know what the content is, but it does not guarantee it's going to be spelled correctly or good grammar in it. That is more or less how magazines and newspapers and websites work, because, and this is just in my case, I loved having the ability to queue up things. So like I would think of maybe 6 articles in a period and throw them into the queue and then pitch them all, and then they would take whatever they want for whatever issue it is. There might be a theme, you don't know. Some magazines do themes. If you ever read a Game Informer, for example, they'll like either January or February each year, they'll do the top whatever of the previous year. So then they theme around their articles of talking about those top games. But then there's, of course, the period of time when new consoles come out. So then, of course, there'll be a feature where it's about that system. So I think recently a couple magazines started posting the Xbox leaks, I guess. I don't know if they were leaks or purposely sent out. Sometimes it seems like they weren't on purpose, but then later on you find out, oh, it was just something we're putting out there to get some buzz. Like the PlayStation 5 logo on Twitter breaking the internet. It gets monotonous, redundant, but if you're really creative, writing for magazines, newspapers, and websites is a great outlet. If you read my book, you actually see, I think in there, I love writing when I'm ticked off and angry. It's just a great motivator to go, okay, somebody says something that is not right and it needs to be fixed. Or maybe the government makes a law, and then I'm like, well, okay, that doesn't seem right, so I need to vent. And again, keep in mind, a lot of this was before there was Twitter and before there was Facebook, where any Joe Blow can go and post off their rant. I mean, you had to put them out somewhere, right? And I was fortunate enough, going to journalism school, to find a way to work at a newspaper even after I worked at a magazine, and just basically throw all this content into my creativity. Just I had all these ideas. I was super creative and made content, and for a number of years, magazines, newspapers, and websites published it. And if you ever decide to write professionally, and I state this as maybe harder to do magazines and websites, but always apply. Just go to the website for these groups and apply. You never know. A lot of them don't require you to necessarily have any real education, just to be a contributor. Give it don't give up on yourself. Give it a shot. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe. Thank you for checking out our content. Before you leave, please remember to click like and then subscribe. If you want to receive notifications, do not forget to enable them by clicking on the bell. Then afterwards, check out our social media at HaslageNet and our website at haslage.net.